Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to take part in this morning's debate in order to expose the Tory failings ahead of the general election, whenever that is called. Because there is no doubt that the Conservatives are not the answer. They are the party of the squires who would keep working people in their servants' quarters. They are the party of public spending cuts, and they are not the party that will take Scotland forward. I would also submit, Deputy Presiding Officer, that this debate is not the best use of parliamentary time. This is a legislative chamber, and what we should be looking at this time is how we use the levers at our disposal in order to protect the Scottish economy, to create jobs, to build more houses, to avert the housing crisis, and to find places for our probationary teachers. In bringing this debate forward, it seems that the Tory boys hanker for a return to the University Debating Club. If a general election were called now, that debate would not be about policy. Never in the field of political discourse has there been so much discussion about politics, but so little discussion about actual policy in recent weeks. An election called now would be all about moats, it would be about duck houses, it would be about a First Minister claiming food when Parliament was in recess. Incidentally, has the First Minister managed to return home from London yet? What a shocking performance yesterday, while we discuss serious legislation at stage 3, to see the First Minister down in the House of Commons, languishing on the green benches. I give way to Michael Russell.
Mike Russell.
I am sure in the interest of fairness the member will want to reflect that the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, since becoming Prime Minister in June 2007, has voted in only 10.8% of divisions in the House of Commons. I think that should be on the record for the interests of fairness.
James Kelly.
Speaking of Prime Ministers, I am reminded that Alex Salmond back in August took time to praise up a previous Conservative Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. In that way, perhaps he was showing his true colours. When the election comes about, that election should be about how we can support the economy, how we can build employment, how we can help businesses, how we can help the banks, and how we can stimulate economic growth. It should be absolutely no surprise that we see the Tories and the Tartan Tories lining up together, as they did in 1979. I see Mr Welsh sitting quietly over there. No wonder he's sitting quietly, because he was one of the guilty men in 1979 that propelled Margaret Thatcher into Downing Street. There's no point.
Order!
I've named Mr Welsh. I'll give way to him.
Andrew Welsh.
Appreciate that. Could I point out, as we said earlier, George Cunningham introduced the 40% rule. What was an offer for Scotland at that point was less devolved power than the Isle of Man or the Channel Islands. And I sat through a House of Commons that gave more devolved power to the island of Tuvalu than it was prepared to give to Scotland. I have no regrets for bringing down a failed...
There's not a speech, Mr Welsh. And James Kelly.
Perhaps Mr Welsh should apologise to the millions of people thrown onto the scrap heap during the Tory years. There's no doubt, I'm sorry, Margaret MacDonald, I've taken 2 interventions. There's no doubt that the SNP wants David Cameron in Downing Street. And the reason for that being that they believe that with the Tories in Downing Street, it would enhance their prospects in any referendum. So that's why they are supporting the Tories and trying to bring forward an election, and they would be supporting with haste David Cameron going into Downing Street. Last Thursday, in the European Elections Day, I spoke to many people in my constituency in Rutherglen and Cambuslang. They did not want a general election. They wanted loud and clear that we don't want the Tories back in. In the area that I grew up in the area that I represent, people remember how the local steelworks were closed and people were thrown onto the scrap heap, and some never to work again. As Polly McNeill has pointed out, security guards were on £1 an hour. Poverty levels rocketed, and all the time, you see the Tories smiling over there, because all the time the Tories stood callously by and let it happen. They didn't intervene. It's not a time for Tories and it's not a time for nationalists. When the election comes, people have long memories. They remember that Labour delivered the NHS, the Tories gave us Margaret Thatcher. Labour delivered the Open University, the Tories gave us a poll tax. Labour delivered the minimum wage, the Tories gave us mass unemployment. I look forward to the election whenever it comes, and I look forward once more and again to seeing the Tories getting a hammer in Scotland.